He was born in the red clay fields of Warren County, Georgia, in the spring of 1828, a season when dogwoods bloomed white against the wounds of plowed earth, and the overseer's whip still echoed where winter silence once lived. And from the first breath he drew, the world already decided his worth in cotton bales and the hours he would spend beneath July suns that blistered backs and branded souls. They called him Elijah because his mother whispered it once in the dark, naming him after the prophet who spoke truth to kings, though she never spoke the name again where ears might hear, for names were a dangerous luxury in the fields, and a mother's hope could be punished as disobedience. His mother, Dinah, worked the spinning house where raw cotton tangled her fingers and the overseer's shadow stretched long across the lint-hung air, and though she feared God, she feared the plantation ledger more, for one determined a soul's salvation, and the other controlled whether that soul was allowed to wake again tomorrow. Elijah's earliest memories were the rust scent of iron pots, the footsteps of men arriving in the dark to take someone who prayed too loudly for freedom, and the faint sweetness of cane syrup his mother saved for him on Christmas, the only day they pretended to be human in the eyes of those who wrote laws and counted prophets like Scripture. By 7, he knew the rhythm of the fields the way a soldier learns battle formation, the horn at dawn, the whip crack on the slow, the silent tears of the old woman who bent over rows as though bowing to a cruel god, and the brutal arithmetic of hunger that ruled every gesture. Eat fast, move fast, never hope fast. He had seen a man whipped until the earth beneath him turned to mud, had seen a girl sent to the big house and returned broken in spirit though her skin remained unmarked, and through each horror he learned the secret rule whispered among those who survived. Knowledge was the only escape. But knowledge was forbidden, hunted, shackled like flesh. Still, curiosity clung to him like the Georgia humidity, thick and relentless, stirring in him each time he heard the white children recite letters on the veranda, while he swept the dust beneath their chairs, tasting envy and awe in equal measure as they read from McGuffey's Reader, their voices soft and careless like people who had never been owned. He did not understand the shapes of the letters, but he recognized power. For when the tutor read Scripture aloud, the mistress bowed her head, and when the planter read the cotton accounts, men rode out on horseback to enforce the numbers, and Elijah, small and unnoticed, understood that words bent the world more violently than whips. The moment that sealed his fate came in the winter of 1836, a night cold enough to make breath visible and bones ache, when the master's youngest son, Henry, dropped a scrap of paper in the yard, inked in shaky scrawl from his first writing lesson, and Elijah stole it as though it were a key to a locked gate, tucking it beneath his shirt with a fear that thrilled and terrified him. Sometimes revolution begins with a single stolen moment, and this one sat against his chest like a living thing, a forbidden flame. That night in the slave quarters, lit by a single ember hidden inside a broken clay pot, Elijah traced the shapes on the paper, not knowing their names, but believing that if white children could shape them, he could too. The quarters smelled of wood smoke, sweat and grief, and his mother, knowing danger when she saw it, tried to snatch the paper away, her hands trembling, for she remembered the boy from Camden County, who lost a thumb for trying to learn his letters, remembered the girl from Burke County sold south because she hid a book beneath a mattress, and she saw the same hunger in her son's eyes that had doomed them. But Elijah held the paper tight, driven by something neither she nor the overseer nor the laws of Georgia could extinguish, a pull older than chains, as old as the human need to name the world and therefore resist its dominion. Knowledge did not arrive as revelation but as slow, painful chiseling against ignorance. Each stolen glimpse of chalk on slate a victory, each overheard lesson a rebellion, and Elijah listened with a memory sharpened by necessity, learning the shapes first, then their sounds, piecing them together in the corners of the servants' corridor whenever he was sent to sweep, until the alphabet became a weapon quietly forming inside him. He traced letters in dust on bark and spilled flour when no one watched, trembling not from fear alone but from the ecstasy of discovery, for he had uncovered a secret road invisible to chains and guards. His first word was God, a word he heard often, always wielded by the master to sanctify labor and obedience. But he understood instantly that knowing how to write it meant power, the kind the master believed belonged only to his bloodline. His second word was free, a word he had heard whispered near the riverbank by men who worked at night forging plans as delicate as spiderwebs and as dangerous as gunpowder. And when Elijah shaped those letters for the first time with trembling fingers in the dirt, the act itself felt like blasphemy and prayer in equal measure. By 1838, he could read small passages from scraps of newspapers left in the ash bin near the smokehouse, pieces recounting political speeches, advertisements for land auctions, and articles about abolitionists in the North whose names were spoken on plantations the way one speaks of storms, distant yet terrifying. He read about Nat Turner's rebellion, though the article called him mad and monstrous, and Elijah, barely 10, understood that history changed meaning depending on who held the ink. He read words like liberty, union, property, and justice, and each one carved a crack in the false world the plantation had built around him. He learned that enslaved people were counted in the 3/5 compromise, reduced to fractions by men who quoted scripture about brotherhood, and he felt a bitter fire spread through him that would not cool. He read of cotton prices rising, of factories in England growing fat on southern cotton, and he realized the plantation was not an isolated cruelty, but part of a global engine fueled by bodies like his, sweated and broken and replaced like worn plow horses. These truths turned his childhood into a battlefield of thought, though no chains rattled and no blood spilled, only the silent revolution of awakening. His mother watched with dread and pride, seeing his mind sharpen into something too bright for the darkness around it, and she feared not only for his life but for the peace of those who clung to quiet survival, because a child who thinks in forbidden terms is a storm brewing in still air, and storms rarely move without destruction. The plantation itself was a kingdom built on lies, with white clapboard columns, rice paper wallpapers shipped from Savannah, and a library filled with leather-bound books Elijah could not touch but could smell when he polished the brass doorknobs, a scent like dust and eternity, knowledge locked behind doors as firmly as enslaved bodies behind laws. The master, Colonel Atticus Barrow, prided himself on paternal benevolence, believing his slaves were loyal because they sang hymns during Sunday service, never noticing the hymns had second meanings, the way sorrow can hide resistance inside melody. He lectured guests about Southern honor and the natural order, claiming slavery was God's design and an economic necessity, all while sipping imported tea sweetened by sugar, cut by Caribbean slaves, a hypocrisy Elijah saw clearly in print and speech, sharpening his understanding that power often disguised itself as morality. Elijah began to see patterns, how the master's wealth swelled with each new field, how banks in Augusta lent money against enslaved bodies as collateral, how steamboats carried cotton down river while preachers in town argued that literacy for slaves would corrode obedience. Knowledge became both mirror and blade, showing Elijah the truth of his world and granting him the means to carve his way through it. He might have remained a secret scholar forever had it not been for the arrival of a pamphlet smuggled by a free sailor into Savannah and circulated quietly among black workers at the docks, a pamphlet Elijah found by chance in the pocket of a borrowed coat given to him for a winter errand to the smokehouse. The pamphlet bore the writings of William Lloyd Garrison and spoke of abolition as not only possible but inevitable, proclaiming slavery a sin and urging action in ink that burned like prophecy. Elijah read it in a barn loft, heart racing, realizing suddenly that he was not alone, that somewhere beyond the cotton and patrol lines, men wrote boldly what he barely dared think. The world expanded beyond Georgia fields into places where black men spoke and wrote freely, where freedom was not rumor but law, where education was not punishable but celebrated. That pamphlet was a spark that turned his quiet learning into purpose. He understood now that reading was not only escape, but evidence, testimony against the empire that claimed ownership of his body and mind. And once a child knows the truth of his oppression, once he reads in his own stolen letters that freedom is a right and not a dream, there is no chain that sits quietly on him again, chain that sits quietly on him again. He entered his 11th year already carrying a secret library inside his skull, a treasury of forbidden symbols and dangerous truths. But knowledge is not a quiet companion. And though he tried to move like any other field boy, head low, steps light, eyes averted, something in his spirit began to stand taller than his body, a posture of the mind that could not be whipped into humility again, and the plantation felt it even before they understood it. The way animals sense a shift in the weather. Yet within this awakening lay a quiet terror, because knowing too much in a place built on ignorance felt like walking through the fields holding a lantern. No one else could see, one spark away from being discovered, and each day Elijah measured risk like a mathematician solving equations under the threat of death, calculating when to look, when to listen, when to store information like seeds in winter soil. His mother saw this change and prayed harder than she ever had, whispering scripture not to pacify him but to protect him, for she sensed he was not destined for silence and feared that destiny might cost him breath. The quarters murmured sometimes about the strange intensity in the boy's eyes, the way he lingered near the veranda when lessons were held, how he swept slower when pages rustled, but most chose not to see. Survival demanded blindness, and anyone who saw too clearly might be forced to choose between courage and life, and that was not a choice many could afford. There came, in the spring of 1839, a moment when his secret began to stretch beyond private awakening into dangerous inevitability. Colonel Barrow, like most planters, kept meticulous records, ledgers listing births, deaths, crop yields, debts owed, slaves purchased and sold, numbers etched into pages like commandments. And Elijah, now old enough to run errands inside the house, often passed by the study where these books lay open beneath oil lamps. One evening, while delivering firewood, he noticed the colonel had stepped away to argue with his overseer outside, their voices sharp and urgent about a delayed shipment to Augusta, and the ledger sat exposed like a kingdom with its gates open. Elijah's pulse thundered as he approached, knowing this was temptation of the most perilous kind. But knowledge had become hunger stronger than fear, and he glanced at the page. There he saw not only names of enslaved people he knew, Martha, Amos, Ruth, Jacob, but dollar values beside them, numbers cold as iron shackles. He traced the figure beside his mother's name, feeling both rage and revelation fill him, understanding now with terrifying clarity that the plantation did not see souls, only assets, and those assets appreciated or depreciated like livestock. But below the names and values lay something even more electrifying. Debts, bank credits, shipments timed to market fluctuations, and cotton contracts with Savannah merchants tied to English mills. The empire of slavery, which had always seemed like a natural world ordained by fate, cracked open to reveal itself as a business, vulnerable, calculated, dependent on paperwork and profit margins and logistics, not divine decree. He understood then that this system could break, because anything built on numbers could collapse under numbers, and that thought ignited him more fiercely than any scripture or story ever could. He did not hear the overseer return, only felt the shadow fall across the desk like a storm setting over a horizon. Ezekiel Hardin, a man carved by cruelty and southern pride, wore suspicion like a second skin, and he saw Elijah too close to the ledger, too still, too intent. A boy caught in proximity to numbers was not a boy who had wandered, but a boy who might be thinking, and Hardin believed thinking was more dangerous among slaves than knives. Elijah snapped back to motion with a nervous speed, snatching a log and pretending to adjust the hearth. But Hardin's eyes narrowed, reptilian, parsing danger beyond what his limited mind could comprehend. Suspicion lingered, though no accusation came that day, and Elijah learned a new truth. Knowledge not only revealed danger, it invited it. That night he lay awake beneath the rough wool blanket, hearing the wind move through pine rafters, replaying the moment again and again, feeling the cold breath of death brush his cheek, not in the form of a whip or chain, but in the shape of curiosity noticed. He resolved to move more carefully, but he also felt a steel form inside him, as though once he had touched the heart of the empire, retreat was no longer possible, because innocence lost cannot be rewoven into safety. Still, secrecy and knowledge do not coexist easily in a human soul, especially a young one. and slowly Elijah's mind sought others who might understand the magnitude of what he carried. There was Samuel, a man in his late 40s who worked in the blacksmith shed, whose wrists bore scars of manacles from a previous plantation, whose eyes had the depth of someone who had seen revolt break and fail more than once. Samuel was known to speak carefully, to counsel quiet endurance rather than rash hope, but he also hummed spirituals beneath his breath that twisted scripture into resistance, and Elijah felt a kinship. One afternoon, while helping carry iron tools to the field, Elijah whispered a single word shaped carefully, "Half-test free." Samuel froze, hammer in hand, the air around them suddenly dense with risk. But instead of reprimand, Samuel slowly nodded, a gesture sparse as winter leaves yet filled with enough understanding to fill a lifetime. That silent exchange was the first crack in Elijah's solitude, a fragile alliance formed not of spoken conspiracy but shared recognition. Over the following weeks, Elijah dropped subtle hints, biblical references twisted into questions about liberation, questions that sounded like innocent musing but carried sharp edges of intent. Samuel answered in the same code, neither encouraging nor discouraging rebellion, but acknowledging it as a living pulse inside the oppressed, too powerful to extinguish. In the same period, Elijah discovered another form of knowledge, newspapers used as wrapping for supplies brought to the plantation storehouse. Sometimes the white clerk discarded torn pages, and Elijah, under pretense of sweeping, salvaged fragments and tucked them inside his shirt, each scrap a world in miniature. These fragments spoke of abolition meetings in Boston, speeches in Philadelphia, escapes through the Ohio woods, and most dangerously, congressional debates about slave territories. In one piece he read of a free black sailor imprisoned under Georgia's Negro Seaman Acts, laws designed to prevent free black ideas from contaminating enslaved minds. Elijah understood instantly that freedom itself was treated as disease, and literacy the contagion feared most by men of power. Another scrap described the trials of men accused of assisting slaves to flee, and he learned about coded language, roots, Northern merchants who funded abolition papers, and Southern lawmakers demanding harsher penalties. As he pieced these fragments together like mosaic tiles stolen one by one, he began to see the architecture of resistance, the hidden arteries pulsing beneath the surface of the nation, connecting plantations to ports, whispers to newspapers, courage to strategy. Then came the Sunday when the visiting preacher delivered a sermon on obedience, emphasizing that servants must honor their masters as divinely ordered. The white congregation nodded approvingly, unaware or unwilling to see the irony that their prosperity rested on broken bodies. Yet Elijah, who had already read abolition scripture in hidden scraps, felt a storm rise inside him, recognizing how the pulpit served as chain as much as the whip. He noticed the preacher's fine coat, the gold watch, the polished boots, wealth extracted from the same labor the sermon sought to sanctify. He watched the master close his eyes in pious contentment, believing his benevolence proven because he allowed slaves to attend worship, never imagining that faith could carry rebellion in its marrow. Elijah realized that religion, like literacy, could be weapon or shackle, depending on who held its meaning. His mind churned with the contradiction, awakening not only to oppression but to its tools, and this insight carved a deeper resolve beneath his ribs. But with awakening came consequences. Hardin continued to watch him, not certain of the boy's crime but convinced instinctively that danger clung to him. Elijah felt the scrutiny like iron nails in soil, and each task he performed became a performance of ignorance. He exaggerated slowness in speech, pretended confusion when near books, forced his gaze downward when papers rustled, learning that survival required masks as surely as bravery required insight. Yet each act of feigned stupidity felt like betrayal of his own intellect, a humiliation forced by necessity, and the dual existence gnawed at him, mind alive, voice silenced. Often he would slip away to the river at dusk, tracing letters in mud before water washed them away, a ritual that reminded him knowledge still lived inside him, even if the world could not see it. Sometimes he practiced forming words that held personal weight. Mother, soul, justice, freedom. And sometimes he wrote names of others enslaved on the plantation, as if writing them might preserve them against erasure history was eager to impose. Summer arrived heavy and oppressive, humidity thick enough to drown breath, and with it came a fever outbreak that spread through the quarters like wildfire. Work did not stop, for cotton waits for no mercy, but bodies weakened and desperation sharpened like blades. Elijah saw women boil willow bark and apply poultices of rosemary and pine tar. Healing practices passed down from ancestors whose knowledge colonizers never recognized as science. It struck him that knowledge existed everywhere, in fields, in herbs, in songs, and whispered histories. Yet only one type was feared enough to punish. The fever stole 3 lives before dawn one week, and the grief in the quarters felt like storm clouds pressing earthward. Elijah began to see that oppression was not only physical domination, but erasure of wisdom, and this understanding broadened his mission. Reading was not simply rebellion, it was reclamation of dignity, a shield against the annihilation of memory. Still, even a child forged by hardship could feel moments of doubt. Some nights he wondered whether knowledge would doom him and those he loved, whether obedience might have bought safety at the cost of soul, whether ignorance, brutal as it was, offered a shelter against consequences he could not yet fully comprehend. But each time these doubts crept in, the memory of the ledger returned, the number beside his mother's name, the cold arithmetic that reduced her life, her song, her laughter, to currency, and his resolve hardened like tempered steel. There would be no retreat. Knowledge once awakened demands movement, and Elijah, even without plan or allies strong enough to risk open rebellion, knew that one day he would have to choose between silent endurance and active revelation, between survival and truth. He did not yet know how such choice would manifest, but he felt it gathering like rain behind distant clouds, inevitable as dawn. That summer also brought a visitor, a cousin of the master from Charleston, a man involved in shipping and trade, who brought with him newspapers, letters, maps, and financial documents. Elijah, assigned to serve at table and clean the study afterward, found himself once again inches from worlds of ink and consequence. From fragments he overheard, he learned that anti-slavery petitions were circulating in the North, that British pressure against slave markets was increasing, that economic anxieties rippled beneath Southern confidence. The cousin spoke disdainfully of abolitionists, calling them fanatics, yet his tone carried undertones of fear masked in arrogance. Elijah absorbed everything. Details of trade routes, cotton brokerage firms, insurance schemes that protected slaveholders against escape or death. The empire was vast, but it was also anxious, aware of enemies, defensive beneath its grandeur. And in that vulnerability, Elijah sensed possibility. By the end of that season, Samuel quietly approached him one evening by the smokehouse, when cicadas filled the air with relentless song and twilight bled into night like ink. Without preamble, he pressed into Elijah's hand a small folded scrap, a psalter page with faint letters, and whispered one sentence so soft it barely shaped sound. "Do not learn alone." It was the closest thing to counsel or blessing Elijah had ever received for his secret pursuit. The world had shifted again. He was no longer merely a boy who knew letters. He was becoming part of a lineage, a quiet thread in a tapestry of resistance older than any plantation and broader than any map. And as he lay awake that night clutching the scrap, heart steady with purpose rather than fear, he understood that his knowledge was no longer seed. It was beginning to root, to seek cracks in the empire's foundation. He woke each dawn now with a sense of expectancy threading through his bones, as though history itself were shifting beneath the red clay, preparing a place for him. Though nothing on the surface of life changed to justify such feeling, he still labored, still bent his back beneath cotton loads too heavy for a child, still tasted dust and sweat as daily bread. Yet a current moved beneath routine, electric and quiet, like the river at night when moonlight reveals motion invisible in sunlight. The season turned toward harvest and rumors drifted in the quarters like ash carried by breeze. whispers of escapes upriver, of patrollers catching a man near Augusta with abolition pamphlets sewn into his coat lining, of a preacher arrested in Savannah for teaching black children to read. And each story sat heavy in Elijah's chest, equal parts warning and confirmation that the world was trembling with change. He studied people with new eyes now, searching faces not just for suffering but for intention, who walked with resignation, who hummed tunes with coded defiance, who held anger behind a polite silence, who possessed the steadiness of those who had seen more than they spoke. His education had shifted from letters to human nature, learning that rebellion was not always fire and blood. Sometimes it was patience, silence weaponized into endurance until the right moment arrived. One humid evening, as cicadas shrieked in trees like living saws cutting through the air, Elijah encountered Ruth, a woman in her 20s whose sister had been sold south 2 years prior, leaving her eyes shadowed permanently as though mourning were a veil she wore rather than a feeling she experienced. She sat outside the quarters turning a small wooden bead in her fingers, a keepsake smoothed by grief and time, and when Elijah passed she lifted her gaze, and something in his expression, a brightness hard to hide now, made her speak him a warning. Without accusation, without knowing his secret, she murmured that smartness was a blade, useful, necessary and deadly if unsheathed at the wrong time. Then she looked away, leaving him with the understanding that some saw more than they admitted, and that survival required not just courage, but timing. Her words lingered in his mind for days, a reminder that pressure could forge diamonds or shatter fragile stone, and even the most righteous fire could burn too soon and consume its own spark before it reached open air. Despite caution, events pressed forward with a force beyond his control. Colonel Barrow's finances tightened as cotton prices fluctuated and creditors pressed with increasing impatience, and in response he demanded more labor, more discipline, more output, as though human bodies were levers to stabilize economic storms. Overseer Hardin doubled punishments, believing fear would compensate for commerce, and the fields became battlegrounds of exhaustion, where hope and bone both cracked. Elijah worked under that sun until sweat stung his eyes like salt water, but his mind roamed beyond rows of cotton, rehearsing what he'd read, calculating weaknesses in the system around him. He began noticing inconsistencies, shipments delayed not by fate but by weather patterns, market dependence on northern banks. The hunger of English mills for southern cotton, making plantation wealth vulnerable to forces beyond any master's control. These were cracks invisible to most, but Elijah saw them like a mason tracking fault lines in a wall, and the knowledge filled him with a strange mix of power and sorrow, for he understood that the world built on bondage was not invincible, yet its collapse might drown countless lives before freedom ever touched them. His opportunity to expand this dangerous understanding came unexpectedly, when Colonel Barrow assigned him to accompany the master's nephew, Thomas, on trips into town to fetch supplies. Thomas was 16, pale and vain, fond of boasting about Harvard aspirations and unaware he stood on sinking ideological ground. He liked the feeling of superiority that came when Elijah followed 2 steps behind with baskets or parcels, and thus spoke freely, believing his words floated only into friendly air. From his idle conversation, Elijah learned about legislative debates in Milledgeville, about Southern militias drilling more frequently after Northern abolition speeches gained traction, about fears that enslaved populations might one day outnumber whites in several counties. He learned that planters were borrowing heavily against future crops, gambling prosperity on soil that was losing fertility year by year, and that whispers circulated in Charleston coffee houses about foreign pressure against the slave trade, returning with renewed force. Each piece fed Elijah's internal map of the empire, and he held these truths close, not for vengeance yet, but for clarity, the way a navigator memorizes stars before nightfall. Town itself became a school. When Thomas lingered at the general store or barber's shop, Elijah swept floors or carried barrels, listening as white men argued politics, cursed tariffs, and dismissed northern moralizing with fragile bravado. He overheard one lawyer mention the case of a literate enslaved carpenter in Milledgeville, executed for forging travel papers. proof that letters could be considered more dangerous than weapons. Another man recounted a rumor of a woman in Virginia teaching slaves hymns that doubled as coded escape maps. Elijah understood now that literacy was battlefield and he a soldier already enlisted without declaration. On market days he watched enslaved people hired out, examined like livestock, families bargaining dignity under the watchful eyes of traders. He watched free black sailors forced to register with authority, their movements restricted as though freedom itself were contraband. These impressions layered inside him like sediment, forming a foundation of rage and resolve so deep it replaced childhood softness with something forged. Yet even as his education broadened, pressure tightened around him. Hardin's suspicions had not faded. He sensed something intangible in Elijah. A posture, a spark, an instinct told him sparks burned barns and systems alike. The overseer began giving Elijah tasks designed to break spirit rather than test strength, ordering him to whip stray livestock though he hesitated, forcing him to stand silent as older men were punished for minor infractions, waiting for the child to flinch or reveal himself emotionally. Elijah learned then that cruelty was not always enacted through direct violence. Sometimes it was engineered to erode conscience or provoke reaction. But instead of breaking, Elijah watched with a detachment born of necessity, storing the overseer's tactics the way a strategist studies enemy formations. And though disgust coiled inside him, he mastered stillness. Not obedience, stillness. There is a difference profound enough to mark whether a soul remains intact. Only once did his mask crack. A boy younger than him, Samuel's nephew, stumbled carrying water, and Hardin struck him with a riding crop so sharply the child collapsed, crying out in shock more than pain. Elijah felt instinct surge, movement before thought, but Samuel's hand landed firm on his shoulder, anchoring him, silent command stronger than force. Later, under cover of dusk, Samuel told him some battles were not fought in daylight or with witnesses. Some required endurance not because fear defeated courage, but because timing shaped destiny. Elijah absorbed this, learning that restraint could be strategy, not surrender. Still, that night he lay awake feeling the sting of injustice like fever beneath skin, and he etched letters into dirt until fingers ached, forming words like endure, rise, or wait, and finally, truth, as though writing them summoned strength. The turning point approached with a subtlety only fate understands. One afternoon, Thomas, distracted and prideful, left a Charleston newspaper on the carriage seat while Elijah watered the horses. The paper was folded open to an editorial condemning abolitionists as northern meddlers, but beneath rhetoric lay references to escaped slaves publishing accounts, to societies raising funds for anti-slavery literature, to shipping agents accused of assisting fugitives. Elijah read quickly, each sentence a portal widening his world, and then his eyes caught mention of a name. Weld, an abolitionist whose pamphlet Samuel once whispered about when speaking of distant hope. The thought that men printed truth openly, without chains or threat, ignited a heat in Elijah's chest, a sense that history beyond the plantation was not only moving, but calling. He returned the paper unnoticed, but something had changed. When he walked back through the stable yard toward the quarters that evening, the sunset painted the sky in violent gold and crimson, and he felt as though the world bled with meaning he could no longer ignore. That night, instead of sleeping, he slipped quietly toward the riverbank where fireflies drifted like sparks from unseen fires. The water reflected sky like a mirror fractured by gentle tide, and Elijah knelt in mud tracing letters again. But this time he formed sentences, imperfect and halting yet alive. The truth is bigger than this place. Words will break the chains. A man is not property. He felt unseen presence in the dark, ancestors perhaps, or simply the weight of history gathering around him. Time stretched and then footsteps approached softly. Samuel emerged from shadows, not surprised to find him awake, not speaking for a long while. When he finally did, his voice carried the tone of someone acknowledging inevitability. There are moments, he said without saying, when knowledge ripens into action, and no force can preserve innocence once truth demands witness. The two sat in silence, watching river currents coil, And Elijah realized that resistance was not always loud or swift. Sometimes it began as shared quiet between those who understood the world's brutality, yet refused to surrender to numbness. He did not yet know what form his rebellion would take: escape, education of others, exposure of plantation accounts, alliance with external forces. But he sensed that his role would not be solitary. Knowledge seeks audience as surely as seeds seek soil, and Elijah now carried truths too potent to die with him should he fall. As he rose to return to the quarters, fireflies flickered around him like stars pulled low to earth, and he felt neither boy nor man but something in between, forged by learning and scarred by reality, ready not for immediate revolt, but for inevitable confrontation with the structure that sought to define and contain him. He slept light that night, body weary yet mind ablaze, and in those brief dreams that came before dawn he did not see chains or overseers. He saw pages, ink, crowds gathering in northern halls, voices speaking his truth in accents he had never heard, railroads winding like veins through forest, coded songs carried by wind, and a future not free of suffering but filled with struggle that meant something beyond survival. When the horn sounded to summon labor at first light, he rose as always, but carried instead of mere endurance a quiet, forming purpose still fragile, still undefined, yet unstoppable as roots beneath frozen ground, preparing to break through earth when spring arrived. The next winter arrived harsh and unforgiving, as though the land itself understood the quiet war unfolding beneath its pine canopy and red clay roads, and Samuel's world tightened with danger, even as his mind expanded with each forbidden phrase he deciphered late at night beneath a sliver of candle flame stolen from the kitchen. Every page he turned seemed to widen the crack in the universe that separated what he had been told he was born for from what he now understood he could become, and with each sentence about constitutions, arguments for abolition, missionary letters from Boston, and court cases in which enslaved men argued their humanity before judges who pretended not to hear them, he felt the strange, terrifying formation of authority inside himself. A voice that insisted knowledge was not merely power but weaponry, a quiet rifle hidden under the floorboards of consciousness. Yet the plantation rhythms marched on as though nothing had shifted in its underbelly. Fields of cotton frozen in white stillness, overseers pacing like wolves scenting invisible rebellion, the master signing ledgers in his study beneath portraits of proud ancestors whose wealth and honor were built on the bones of men who never appeared in family history books, and the mistress reading scripture about obedience while pretending not to hear the soft weeping of women, whose children she claimed as her property. Samuel worked like the others, picking lint from his cut fingers, grinding corn until his back ached, hauling slop to pigs, and sweeping paths before dawn so white feet could walk clean. But inside him the world had cracked open and no one could sweep that truth away. Cracked open and no one could sweep that truth away. He had memorized the alphabet, then whole words, then paragraphs, until he could read faster than many white boys his age, though he still pretended to stumble over letters when forced to recite from a prayer card for the mistress's amusement, masking brilliance behind feigned dullness as survival demanded. But the more he learned, the harder it became to act small. And one evening, as he sat in the smokehouse hiding a scrap of newspaper beneath salted pork, he heard footsteps outside, heavy, certain like a verdict. His heart seized, but instead of the overseer's boots, the door cracked open and revealed Mary, the house servant who had once passed him the hymn book on a Sunday morning without speaking a word, yet whose eyes carried entire languages. She whispered that whispers were circulating through the quarters. A child had been caught tracing letters in the dirt at a plantation 20 miles away, and was whipped until his back turned to raw earth. And the master there threatened to sell every young boy on the property because knowledge spreads like infection. Fear seeped through Samuel not like panic, but like icy clarity, a sudden realization that silence was not safety but slow death. Yet rashness meant immediate ruin. He thanked her, though no sound passed his lips, and she left as quietly as she came, her face tight with the ache of carrying a warning she could not fully understand, but sensed might determine whether someone lived to see next spring. Samuel's secret life tightened. He moved the pages he studied to different hiding places each week, switched candles for smoldering pine splinters, learned to breathe silently so that even shadows would not betray him. And at the same time, the world outside began to change in ways that signaled violence brewing. Anonymous pamphlets arrived in town condemning slavery, enraging white planters. Rumors of rebellions in Florida and Texas drifted like wildfire sparks. Preachers thundered about loyalty and submission, while plantation patrols doubled in size and cruelty, dragging men from cabins at night, accusing them of plotting insurrections that existed only in the fevered nightmares of those who feared justice catching up. Samuel listened from the fields to distant screams sometimes, not knowing whether they were human or wind or memory, but understanding that noise was never just noise in a place built on control. His reading shifted from curiosity to strategy. He studied maps, agricultural ledgers, and trade reports in the master's office when cleaning duty offered access, learning how shipments moved from Savannah to Charleston, how cotton credits disguised human mortgages, how bodies were leveraged in banks the same way livestock and land were, and how debt, pride, and violence braided together to form something that looked like Southern honor but was nothing more than a throne built on the blood and labor of people who were never asked to kneel because chains rendered asking unnecessary. One night he discovered a ledger that froze him, a list of names with prices, weight estimates, and ages, including children yet unborn marked as future yield. The column title did not say slave infants. It said assets projected. He felt his breath crush inside him like glass. He traced the ink with shaking fingers, recognizing the name of Mary's little brother on the list, assigned a future market value before the boy had lost his front milk teeth. In that moment, something hardened in Samuel, not fury, which had been simmering for months, nor sorrow, which had become the background weather of existence, but a decision. A cold and terrifying clarity that knowing the truth was no longer enough. Truth demanded use, and hidden knowledge was simply shackled knowledge. Yet he also understood that one wrong move would not only kill him, but bring devastation upon those who trusted him. Without ever asking to be part of his mission, he began quietly memorizing numbers, inventories, loan terms, and supply routes, storing them in a private mental sanctuary like contraband seeds he intended to plant one day, when soil and season aligned. His mind became dual. One part obedient boy answering to every command with bowed head and empty eyes, the other part strategist, archivist, chronicler, rebel scholar building a silent case against an empire that called itself civilization. Winter thawed slowly, stubbornly, with rain carving scars into the earth like the lash carved scars into backs. And while the riverbanks swelled with new life, the plantation's interior world grew tense, brittle, paranoid. A letter arrived from Savannah discussing abolitionist agitation and the possibility of northern newspapers smuggling arguments into the region disguised as business correspondence. Soon after, the master began locking his study cabinet and carrying the key in his pocket, unaware that Samuel had already consumed more knowledge than locks could bar. And yet knowledge alone did not fill bellies or protect bones. And the reality of danger pressed tighter when young Ben from the fields disappeared overnight. No explanation offered, no farewell granted, only whispered speculation that he had been sold for showing too much cleverness in his eyes. Mothers held their children closer, fathers avoided eye contact with overseers, and songs in the quarters changed from spiritual yearning to coded warnings, their harmonies trembling with the weight of dread. Samuel moved like a shadow, learning stealth not from books but necessity. Yet as spring approached, something inside him also awakened that felt like an ancestor's whisper. History was not written solely by those with ink, but also by those who refused to be erased. On a night heavy with frog song and lantern insects, he stole briefly into the barn loft where old Isaac, a man whose back carried the cartography of punishment and whose gaze bore a lifetime of defiant endurance, sat humming a tune older than the plantation system itself. Isaac did not ask why Samuel approached or what he carried inside him. The silence between them spoke a language beyond words, and when Samuel whispered a single sentence, not a plan, not a confession, but a simple declaration that he could read, Isaac closed his eyes as though feeling a wind shift. He placed a trembling, scarred hand on Samuel's shoulder, And that gesture, light as dusk, felt heavier than iron because it was not fear, not shock, not reprimand. It was recognition. Samuel did not know whether Isaac believed this revelation was a curse or a calling, but the old man finally exhaled a single breath that sounded like prayer, blessing, and warning all at once. And from that night forward, Samuel no longer felt alone in the terrifying knowledge that literacy was no longer merely a secret. It was destiny. And destiny, he realized, was not a path one followed but a battlefield one entered. The spring that followed did not arrive gently but stormed into Georgia like a restless spirit, cracking thunder across lowland fields and shaking loose pollen, fear, and the lingering bones of winter in one violent sweep. And Samuel felt as though the weather itself was mirroring the turbulence rising inside him, a tension between growth and danger that stretched tighter. With every hidden sentence he absorbed in silence, the plantation buzzed with new activity. Plowing, planting, repairing fences, counting tools, tightening protocols, and with every new task came watchful eyes. Suspicion sharpened by rumors of uprisings in distant counties and talk in the master's parlor that abolitionists in Boston were sending poison into southern minds faster than bullets, and Samuel understood that the poison they feared was not blades or gunpowder, but truth. And the very panic in white voices told him the empire they commanded was built not on strength but on dread. Dread that knowledge might seep into the wrong skull and unravel the lies that propped up their world like brittle scaffolding around a rotting monument. Yet while ideas gave him spine, reality clawed at him with teeth. The more he learned, the more fragile life felt, as if every breath he took balanced on the thin edge of discovery and ruin. He had become adept at navigating books and ledgers, but survival demanded more than intellect. It demanded reading people, moods, silences, footsteps, and the invisible currents that dictated when one could move without being noticed. Some nights he felt imprisoned, not by the plantation, but by his own expanding awareness. Ignorance had once been a blanket, thin but warm, whereas knowledge was a torch that illuminated horrors too large to unsee. Every whipping post he passed seemed sharper in focus, every auction rumor heavier, every crying mother louder, and he understood with new acuity that literacy had not freed him. It had drafted him into a war he did not choose but could no longer retreat from. Mary became his silent ally, always careful, never asking questions but sometimes leaving cloth scraps near the kitchen where he could use them to muffle flickers of firelight while he studied in the smokehouse. Her face was thinner now, worry carving delicate lines that no girl her age should carry. And Samuel felt the weight of her trust like a chain of responsibility. If he failed, she would suffer too. He dreamt increasingly of restless figures, ancestors perhaps, or spirits of those who had walked this soil shackled long before him, whispering in languages older than English, reminding him that no knowledge gained in chains came without a price in blood or memory. In those dreams he saw a river swollen with papers, bills of sale, shipping records, Bibles, school books, and the river ran red not with vengeance but with testimony, as though truth itself had drowned in the tide of empire. But truth, he realized, could rise again, if carried not by books alone but by mouths, minds, and courage disguised as obedience. So he continued memorizing numbers, routes, bank names, ship schedules, loan records, and whispered scandals the master thought safe because they were spoken only among men who believed themselves untouchable. He learned the plantation was leveraged against cotton futures. The master's debt stretched dangerously thin, and whispers suggested that a single bad crop could send the estate into financial collapse. Vulnerability hidden under loud confidence like rot beneath fresh paint. Samuel felt a strange, sharp focus bloom inside him as he gathered this information, like a hunter mapping the weaknesses of prey that had long mistaken itself for predator. Yet while he studied money like a battlefield map, human cost pressed harder. One evening, a young girl only 9 years old was slapped by the mistress for dropping tea china, and Samuel watched as the child trembled not from pain but humiliation so deep it threatened to swallow her. And he knew then that every tally in the ledger he secretly memorized corresponded not just to bodies but to souls, slowly crushed by the machinery of ownership. He carried those faces in his mind alongside the figures and legal arguments he read, understanding that the war he was waging inside himself was not abstract but personal, every statistic a memory, every law a wound. He found himself praying not for rescue but for clarity, that when the moment came to act, he would not betray those whose lives hung on his choices. The plantation's overseer, a man called Thorn whose voice could silence birds mid-song, began paying Samuel more attention, watching him with the suspicion of a wolf sensing intelligence in what he hoped was prey. Thorn did not trust quiet, and Samuel's habit of lowering his gaze and working without complaint seemed to irritate him more than backtalk would have. Predators crave resistance to justify cruelty, and Samuel's stillness denied Thorn that easy pleasure. Twice the overseer cornered him, asking why he always seemed to listen so hard when white men talked. And twice Samuel bowed and muttered something about wanting to be useful, training his voice to shake just enough to invite dismissal rather than curiosity. But fear began gnawing at him, a slow, constant hunger in his chest, reminding him that brilliance in captivity was not a lantern, but a flare attracting executioners. It was Isaac who steadied him, not with words but with presence. The old man would sit by the river when work ended, letting water wash over his bare feet, staring into the dusk as though conversing with spirits across time. Samuel began joining him, never speaking unless Isaac spoke first, learning patience and stillness as essential tools of resistance. One afternoon, while the sky turned copper and cicadas hummed like distant drums, Isaac murmured that knowledge was like fire, useful only if controlled, deadly if wild, and visible from miles when darkness fell. Samuel realized then the importance of timing. Rebellion was not spontaneous fury but precise alignment of risk and readiness, and rushing truth before the soil could bear it would lead not to liberation but slaughter. Still, waiting did not mean passivity. Samuel began subtly seeding awareness, not through overt instruction but through quiet questions, small provocations, and stories framed as curiosity. He asked younger boys whether they ever wondered how plantations earned money before cotton grew. He asked older men if they remembered hearing elders speak of free black communities in the North. He told Mary once, in careful metaphor, that sometimes plants broke through stone not by pushing fast but by growing steady in darkness until stone forgot to fear what lay beneath it. And though he never admitted his literacy to anyone else, he sensed that some knew or guessed, or at least felt change breathing near them like dawn's first stirring wind. Danger escalated when a trader arrived from Charleston with newspapers, and Samuel overheard him brag that abolitionists in London were publishing slave narratives, a revelation that struck him like lightning. Stories were escaping. Truth had already begun leaking beyond borders carved by violence. And with every leak the South tightened its grip. Patrols thickened, sermons grew harsher, and one Sunday the master read aloud a law declaring it treason to teach enslaved people to read, his voice shaking with anger that sounded suspiciously like fear. Samuel stood still during that reading, eyes lowered, but inside him something roared. Rage not at the law which he already lived beneath, but at the trembling he heard in the master's words, proof that knowledge terrified power more than rebellion ever had. Soon after, the plantation held an inventory inspection, and Samuel feared discovery not by accident but by malice. Thorn searched cabins, overturned bedding, demanded to see hands, pockets, shoes, as though letters might bleed from skin. Samuel kept calm, every heartbeat measured, every breath calculated to appear ordinary. When Thorn found nothing, frustration twisted his face, and Samuel knew a man denied justification for violence often created one. He expected punishment anyway, perhaps contrived, but none came that night. Instead, Thorn simply stared at him long and hard the next morning, and the cruelty in his gaze promised that suspicion, once born, never died. It merely waited for opportunity. So Samuel hid deeper, not his texts. For those were already dispersed or committed to memory. But his purpose, he moved through days like a ghost disguised as a boy, offering no spark for predators to pounce on. But inside he sharpened himself. He memorized shipping cycles for rice and cotton, He learned which planters owed debts and which banks held liens. He tracked whispers of a northern journalist rumored to be traveling the South in disguise. Information became his library, his weapon, his shield. And yet, amid the dangerous clarity of mission, grief lived like a second pulse in him. He watched a mother see her son dragged away at auction because the master needed cash to repair the mill wheel, and Samuel recorded the event not in ink but in the vault of his soul, imprinting every scream so it could one day testify through him. He saw Ben's mother sitting silent by the river days later, staring into nothing, already half absent from the living world, and Samuel realized knowledge did not spare one from sorrow. It deepened it, sharpened it, made one feel every injustice not as tragedy but as evidence, but sorrow was fuel. And Samuel, though still only a boy in stature, felt himself growing into something heavier than flesh or years. A witness being forged, a historian in chains gathering ammunition for a war of truth. And as he lay one night listening to distant dogs bark along the patrol road, and the low moan of wind slipping between trees like a ghost remembering freedom, he understood with chilling certainty that the moment when knowledge would need to become action was approaching like a storm crest over the horizon, dark, inevitable, trembling with power. He would be ready, he told himself, not with hope but with resolve, because learning to read had not simply opened his eyes, it had sworn him to duty, and duty, once awakened, refused to sleep again. The summer sun rose heavy and merciless over the plantation that year, pressing heat into soil and skin until sweat felt less like moisture and more like evidence of survival. And Samuel moved through each day as though time itself had thickened into something that resisted motion, breath, and hope. Yet beneath the blistering rhythm of labor and obedience, he sensed an undercurrent like the charged stillness before lightning, a collective breath held by the land and those bound to it, as if the soil knew secrets about to surface. News traveled strangely in places of oppression, floating through choked air and whispered corridors, and that season brought stories of rebellions in Florida crushed with brutal efficiency, of enslaved sailors in Savannah caught smuggling pamphlets aboard cargo ships, and of Southern newspapers calling for harsher laws with urgency that betrayed panic, disguised as authority. The master and his friends discussed politics nightly over bourbon, dismissing abolitionists as hysterical radicals, while their voices occasionally cracked with unease, and Samuel listened from shadowed hallways like a ghost taking inventory of fear. Yet while the great tremors of history rattled distant states, it was a single personal shock that pierced Samuel first. Isaac fell gravely ill. The old man's body, worn from decades of toil and scarred by lashes that never fully healed, began to fail with quiet inevitability. His breathing turned shallow, his hands trembled, and his gaze, once sharp with memory, softened into a far-away contemplative haze. Samuel sat with him in stolen moments, feeling the weight of what Isaac embodied, generations of endurance, knowledge held in bones rather than books, wisdom accumulated in silence, resilience carved by suffering yet never surrendered. Isaac's voice was barely audible one afternoon when he murmured that freedom did not always mean escape or survival. Sometimes it meant leaving a piece of truth behind for the next soul to carry forward. Samuel felt something inside him crack, not in despair but in oath. Isaac was a bridge, and bridges did not die. They passed weight onwards. As the old man's strength faded, Samuel returned to the ledgers in the master's office with renewed urgency, committing each column to memory like prayers. He now knew the plantation owed large sums to a Savannah creditor, and that a drought last year had already strained margins. He understood that the master's confident speeches about the eternal stability of Southern wealth were lies layered atop loans, and that financial fragility was the hidden throat of the empire, soft, vulnerable, exposed to pressure and truth. But knowledge also meant witnessing pain intimately, and one morning he heard a whip crack not across backs but across dignity, as a teenage boy named Jonah was dragged to the yard and beaten for allegedly stealing corn. Though Samuel had seen corn rotting in the storerooms untouched, proof that scarcity was never the enemy, control was. Jonah did not cry, and the absence of his voice felt louder than any scream. Samuel pressed his forehead to the barn wall, teeth clenched, understanding that learning to read meant learning to see cruelty in high resolution. Every lash a sentence in a story the world pretended not to read. The master's son. Henry returned from college in Virginia during this time, bringing books, arrogance, and the self-righteous cruelty of a young man fed on ideology and entitlement. He noticed Samuel on the first day, his gaze lingering too long, and soon began testing him with questions disguised as casual curiosity. "What do you think of Scripture?" he asked once while Samuel poured water into a pitcher, and Samuel answered with practiced emptiness, reciting verses about obedience and humility he had memorized for these very moments. Henry smirked, unconvinced yet amused, the way a cat watches a mouse pretending to be dead. Samuel felt a chill that heat could not dissolve. Young white men with too much time and power were among the most dangerous creatures in the South, and Henry's presence became a ticking hazard in Samuel's mind. But danger did not only come from above. Among the enslaved, tension also simmered, not from betrayal but from survival instincts sharpened by desperation. One night Samuel overheard whispers in the woods, young men debating escape, armed with hope but little strategy. They did not know what Samuel knew about patrol routes, debts, shipping schedules, and the brutal mathematics of punishment. He wanted to tell them that raw courage without planning was slaughter, but silence weighed on him because revealing his knowledge to men he could not entirely trust meant risking everything before the time was ripe. His heart ached with divided loyalty, the duty to protect them clashing with the knowledge that premature rebellion would doom them all. In that moment he understood that leadership was not merely knowledge, it was burden, guilt, restraint, and sacrifice. As Isaac's decline deepened, Samuel witnessed the older man's final days filled not with despair but with a kind of spiritual preparation, whispering prayers in gullah rhythms and speaking occasionally to empty air, as though ancestors crowded around him. When Isaac passed quietly beneath a humid dusk sky, the quarters did not weep loudly. They hummed low dirges, grief carried in breath and stillness, because loud mourning was forbidden and even sorrow required camouflage. Samuel buried his face in his hands afterward, not because Isaac's death was unexpected, but because his departure signaled an impending shift. The weight was now fully on him. There was no elder to ask for guidance, no back older than time to lean against. He was the keeper now, the witness destined to speak when the world was finally forced to listen. That same week brought another harbinger. An enslaved man from a neighboring plantation was found hanging from a tree near the riverbank. Not by rope, but by the narrative imposed upon him. They claimed he killed himself out of guilt for plotting insurrection, a fiction Samuel recognized as violence wearing the mask of righteousness. The body hung not just in death, but as message, a grotesque proclamation that knowledge and defiance would be punished beyond death. Samuel stared at the scene from a distance, knowing fear was the intended harvest, and he swallowed it like poison, letting it become fuel rather than paralysis. The universe, he realized, rarely granted rebels the luxury of safety while preparing. History demanded courage before certainty, action before assurance. One afternoon, while organizing papers in the office under watchful supervision, Samuel discovered a letter partially hidden beneath. A stack of bills, a correspondence between the master and a legislator discussing a proposal to legally mandate branding for enslaved people who attempted literacy. The words blurred in front of him, not from shock but from fury that felt ancient, volcanic, ancestral, branding knowledge onto flesh as punishment for seeking humanity. There were no metaphors left, only naked brutality masquerading as governance. He folded the letter back into place and left the office with a calmness so precise it resembled prophecy. The South was tightening its fist to crush what it feared, and fists, when clenched too hard, eventually shattered bones, including their own. The world did not pause for reflection. The cotton needed tending, pigs fed, tools repaired, prayers forced, endurance demanded. But Samuel's inner momentum accelerated. He began planning not escape but revelation. Flight was freedom for one. Exposure was liberation for many. He collected names in his memory, warehouse agents, Tobacco brokers, overseers who violated women, ministers who baptized cruelty, merchants who traded flesh with the same tone used for discussing weather patterns. He understood now that his life's purpose was not to run from power but to strip it naked. Yet action required catalyst, and it arrived one sweltering evening when Henry, drunk and restless, cornered Mary in the laundry shed. Samuel saw it from across the yard, his vision narrowing into a tunnel of instinct and fire. But he forced his feet to remain planted, knowing one reckless intervention would destroy him and worsen her fate. Instead, he walked away outwardly calm and vomited behind the smokehouse, his body rejecting the helplessness his mind had to tolerate. Later, Mary emerged shaken but unharmed, though her eyes carried a new shadow that made Samuel's chest burn with a promise he could not yet fulfill. There were no safe choices, only strategic ones, and choosing when to fight was as crucial as the fight itself. That night, as frogs croaked and the moon hung heavy like a judgment, Samuel placed his palm on the cabin floorboards and whispered not a prayer but a vow. He would not be silent when the moment arrived. He would not die with knowledge locked inside him. He would turn the plantation's secrets into weapons sharper than any blade, louder than any rebellion, undeniable in their precision. And as heat lightning flickered beyond distant pines, illuminating the world in sudden stark truth, he felt a certainty settle in his bones that was neither hope nor despair. It was inevitability. The empire believed itself eternal. But Samuel had seen its ledgers, its fears, its fragile scaffolding. Empires did not fall when attacked from without. They crumbled when exposed from within, and he, a boy in chains, held the blueprint of its undoing. The time was coming when silence would no longer be shield but betrayal, and when that moment arrived, his story would cease to be secret and become testimony, unyielding, unforgiving, unstoppable. Knowledge had made him dangerous, and danger in a world built on lies was the first step toward truth. The final turning did not arrive in a roar but in a whisper, quiet as the first crack inside a dam built on suffering and denial, and Samuel felt it before he saw it. A subtle shift in the air like breath being held by history itself. The heat still hung thick, cicadas still wailed in relentless cadence, cotton bowls still swelled beneath blistering sun, and yet something in the world tasted different, as though the earth had begun to tremble beneath invisible footsteps marching toward inevitable reckoning. That morning a traveling preacher arrived from Savannah, a man with a soft voice and sharp eyes carrying not just a Bible, but a satchel that clinked faintly when he moved. He came under the guise of spiritual revival, promising salvation to the enslaved and reassurance to the masters, but Samuel knew how to read what lay beneath surfaces. His speech was measured, too careful, his gaze lingering too long on the enslaved faces in the crowd, searching not for souls but for signals, and when he spoke scripture about truth setting men free, his eyes flicked just briefly toward Samuel. The master welcomed him with pride, another show of piety before neighbors and overseers, and that evening a dinner was held in his honor, where men bragged about their acreage, bloodlines, breeding stock, and loyalty to Southern order. Samuel served food in silence, absorbing every exchange, noting the preacher's calm smile as planters joked about whipping literacy out of uppity boys. At one point, the preacher leaned back, swirling his wine, and remarked that the world was shifting. England had abolished slavery, northern newspapers howled louder each season, and trade alliances abroad no longer turned blind eyes so easily. The room chilled despite summer heat, and the master laughed too forcefully, asking whether foreign sympathies were now trespassing on scripture. The preacher simply smiled again, slow and unreadable. Samuel saw the tension spark beneath polite hospitality, like sparks hidden inside smoke, and he recognized both danger and opportunity woven into that brief exchange. Later, when the house fell quiet and the white men retired drunk to leather chairs, Samuel passed through the corridor to extinguish lanterns. As he walked by the study, he heard the preacher's voice, low, firm, and stripped of its earlier softness, speaking to the master alone. "You are running out of time," he said, not as threat but prophecy. "Economies collapse not when challenged, but when illusion meets daylight." The master sputtered in fury, accusing the preacher of poisoning Southern unity, and Samuel slipped away before footsteps could discover him, pulse hammering with the knowledge that forces larger than one plantation were moving, tightening, converging like storm clouds gathering over brittle scaffolding of power. But the preacher was not the moment. The moment came 2 weeks later, when a shipment ledger went missing. Samuel had not taken it. He no longer needed documents when every number, date, and signature lived inside his memory, but someone had, and the master erupted in panic. Men searched every building, tore apart cabins, interrogated laborers with threats soaked in rage and fear. The overseer Thorne paced like a dog starved for permission to bite, eyes burning with suspicion that had grown ever since his first glance at Samuel months earlier. And then, in a tragic symmetry that history repeats like ritual sacrifice, the wrong boy was accused. Young Caleb, barely 12, nothing in his pockets but lint and a small carved toy his father had shaped for him, was dragged to the yard and bound to the whipping post while his mother screamed until her voice collapsed into raw silence. Samuel stood frozen, horror pressing into his lungs like 1,000 stones. Truth knew he was innocent. Caleb did not know letters beyond those etched into memory by Bible songs and sorrow. Yet innocence held no weight in a world where power rewrote reality as convenience. Thorne raised the whip, and in that instant Samuel learned the precise sound of the human heart, trying to break and resist at once. He felt the universe tilt, felt the earth's breath stop, felt Isaac's spirit somewhere behind him, ancient and steady like an oak grown over graves. He stepped forward, not consciously, not bravely, but inevitably, as though a hand older than time pressed against his spine. "He didn't do it," he said, not loud but clear as iron. Silence fell heavier than stone. The master blinked, confused by defiance coming from a boy who had mastered the art of invisibility. Thorne smiled with sick anticipation. "And how would you know?" the master asked. Samuel's throat tightened, but fear no longer held reign. Something fiercer had risen in its place. He lifted his gaze, no longer lowering his eyes like habit demanded, and in that gaze lived every name he had memorized, every lash he had witnessed, every ledger he had decoded, every law he had secretly read, every spirit he had inherited from ancestors who refused to disappear. "Because I read your ledgers," he answered, voice trembling not with weakness but with truth too heavy for a child to carry quietly anymore. Gasps cracked across the yard like lightning splitting a tree. Someone dropped a bucket. The world did not move, not wind, not birds, not breath. Then the whip fell, not on Caleb but on Samuel, and pain lit his back like fire, but he did not fall. He stood with blood soaking his shirt, with flesh open like testimony carved unwillingly into skin, and he spoke again. "He didn't do it, and you know it." Thorne struck him harder, furious that defiance refused to kneel, that truth had dared to surface unmasked. Blow after blow, the overseer delivered brutality shaped his order. And yet Samuel's eyes stayed anchored on the master, not the weapon, not the executioner, naming the guilt silently, accusing without raising a finger. Finally, gasping and trembling, the master raised his hand, not to strike but to stop. Thorne froze mid-motion, caught in a hierarchy older than cruelty itself, and Samuel sagged only slightly, refusing to collapse until ordered by gravity, not men. They dragged him to the cellar then, darkness wrapping him like burial cloth, and for 3 days he hovered between worlds, feverish, aching, ribs bruised, back torn open, but mind incandescent with clarity not even pain could drown. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned, yet visions flooded him. Isaac calling from riverbanks, mothers holding babies sold at sunrise, ships crossing oceans with bodies shackled in darkness, the preacher's warning tone, Mary's silent fear hardening into steel, Caleb's trembling hands, and beyond all of it, a horizon glowing with future light, distant but real, as though truth had already begun traveling toward him faster than blood could dry. On the third night he heard footsteps above, hushed and hurried. The cellar door creaked softly, and Mary slipped down with water and torn cloth, tears glimmering but voice steady. "They fear what you know," she whispered. "They fear what you saw, and now they fear what you said." Word had spread. Through quarters, through pine forest, through whispered channels slavery could mutilate but never silence. Samuel had not escaped. He had ignited. Fear twisted plantation order like sickness. Overseers patrolled with trembling hands, and the master wrote frantic letters seeking advice, as if ink could mend a system cracking under the weight of its lies. On the fourth morning, government men arrived from Savannah, grim, stiff, wearing righteousness like armor. They demanded Samuel be turned over for investigation, which meant disappearance into the machinery of state violence. But when they dragged him to the yard, something unexpected awaited. Not silence, not fear, but a sea of faces. Men, women, elders, and children standing in still, defiant quiet. They did not speak. Silence itself became rebellion. Witness shield. Eyes burned with grief and rage, and Samuel felt their presence like arms holding him upright. The officials faltered, not because compassion struck them, but because spectacle threatened order. And spectacle was dangerous fuel. They took Samuel away anyway, forcing him onto a wagon, driving him toward Savannah where prison or worse awaited. But even bound and bleeding, Samuel held victory inside him. Not escape, not safety, but revelation. The plantation's name was now tied to fear. Its ledgers no longer silent. Whisper networks carried his story like wind through grass. Riders passed word to coastal ports. The preacher's satchel clinked louder with purpose. Letters began disappearing from courthouse shelves. Rumors of debt, abuse, exploitation, forced breeding, corruption spread faster than patrols could chase. Samuel did not see freedom, not in that moment, not in that season. But the South felt the fracture, small yet irreversible, and long after the wagon wheels rolled away, people still gathered beneath moss-draped oaks at dusk, repeating his name like prayer, like promise, like prophecy. Children traced letters in dirt with quiet reverence. Old men sat straighter when patrols passed. Women hummed low songs of resistance that disguised fire as lullaby. And somewhere on a cell floor lit by slivers of sun through iron bars, Samuel pressed his hand to his healing back and whispered to the unseen world. Not silent, not forgotten, not finished. Truth had entered the world with his blood, and truth once born does not die. It travels, grows, sharpens, finds voices in places power cannot reach. Years later, when warships thundered, when proclamations rang across broken plantations, when paper declared freedom but scars declared history, people would speak his name not as legend but as evidence, of a boy who learned to read in chains and made an empire tremble with nothing but memory, courage, and the unbearable weight of truth. His story would not end with him. It had already begun to live in others, and in the quiet spaces between oppression and uprising, where history bends not in battlefields but in breaths taken by the brave before the world is ready. The wind whispered through Georgia pines a vow older than empire and louder than fear. Knowledge never dies.